Spell armors have been part of fantasy lore for as long as there have been fantasy stories. The big, burly tank wears plate armor to protect themselves, and the robe-wearing mage relies on magic to protect them. In D&D, the spell Mage Armor reads, "You touch a willing creature who isn't wearing armor, and a protective magical force surrounds it until the spell ends. The target's base armor class becomes 13 plus its dexterity modifier. The spell ends if the target dons armor, or if you dismiss the spell as an action. Last 8 hours. What this spell basically does is give a player who isn't wearing any armor equal to that of medium armor, like wearing leather or light mail. The spell armors for mages in WoW work in a similar vein, and have changed to do many different things throughout WoW's lifespan, with the constant of giving the mages extra defenses in one way or another. In this video, we'll be going over the Frost Armors, Frost Armor and Ice Armor. Frost Armor in one of its earliest forms was a Lich ability in Warcraft 3, which when cast on a unit would slow the haste and movement speed of whatever attacked that unit. When the ability was carried over to WoW, it kinda kept the same effect. Frost Armor was the first mage spell armor that mages could learn, as they got it right off the bat at level 1. And just like the Warcraft 3 version, it would make it so whoever attacked the mage while the armor was up would sometimes get a haste and movement speed debuff. In addition, Frost Armor also gave the mage some extra armor, which was the only thing that increased with higher ranks of the spell. Frost Armor was considered the lesser version of the Icey armors, as later on while a mage was leveling up, they would get a new armor called Ice Armor, which was exactly like Frost Armor, in that it gave the mage extra armor and the slow debuffs, but in addition, it also gave a little bit of frost resistance. Once you learned Ice Armor, you no longer got new ranks of Frost Armor, so Frost Armor was pretty much exclusively a low-level mage ability only. Now, I'll be going over Ice Armor in more detail later on in this video, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Now, despite Frost Armor being like a defensive stance, so to speak, for mages, up until patch 2.4, or towards the end of the Burning Crusade, it could be dispelled. But to be fair, a lot of class armor type spells could be dispelled in early WoW, so that's not super surprising. Hell, until Legion, the Paladin's main cooldown Avenging Wrath could still be dispelled. In Wrath, Frost Mages had a talent where every time you chilled a target, you had a 15% chance to freeze them for 5 seconds. Freeze in this case was actually just a Frost Nova root, but still, this meant while you had one of the Icy armors up, a mage could just passively root players who attacked them in melee. There were also glyphs to increase the armor granted by 50%, and another to increase its duration by 30 minutes. Although this was also back when glyphs gave legitimate DPS upgrades. So I can't really see a practical use for extra armor outside of maybe doing solo content, or if you're a PvPer, maybe. But to be fair, at least the 1 hour armors glyph was only a minor glyph, and most minor glyphs sucked or didn't give DPS boosts, so it was probably used. In Cataclysm, Blizzard removed nearly all lower level abilities and ranks, and with this pruning they also merged Ice and Frost Armor into a new armor called Frost Armor. Or I guess I should say they removed Ice Armor and added its effect to Frost Armor. And with this merger, Frost Armor now also provided a small resistance buff, in addition to its normal effect of increasing armor and applying a slow debuff to attackers. Then, one patch later, in patch 4.1, the frost resistance was removed. Such a shame. The armor labeled as Frost Armor only actually gave frost resistance for one patch in its lifetime. In addition to the frost resist change, it was also changed to reduce physical damage by 15% instead of granting a 20% armor boost. The haste slow was decreased from 25% to 20%, but now also affected range attack speed, or it finally affected hunters to be more precise. And then it was given its very own glyph. The Frost Armor glyph gave mages 2% of their maximum mana every 5 seconds, which wasn't very useful, seeing as Mage Armor at this time gave 3% mana every 5 seconds baseline. But I guess it could have been situationally useful in PvP or something, since Cataclysm was also Blizzard's first attempt to make DPS players not need to worry about mana anymore. Except for Arcane Mages, of course, because that's kind of their whole playstyle. And I say attempt because some DPS classes could still run out of mana. It just wasn't anywhere near as bad as it used to be, when Blizzard thought all mana classes needed to worry about managing their mana, instead of just healers and Arcane Mages like we have today. Admiss, Frost Armor was reworked again, and then went through a little tweaks to get the numbers right, but in its final version it was changed to no longer increase your armor nor slow attack speed, and instead would just increase your haste by 7% and slow attackers' movement speed only when attacked. In addition to having a 3-second cast time now, but lasts forever. The glyph of armors was changed at this time too, from increasing the duration of all armors by 30 minutes, to instead reducing the cast time of armors by 1.5 seconds, and increasing their defensive effects by 10%. The reason for the cast time addition to armors was to stop mages from armor swapping in PvP. And this is also when Blizzard was cutting down on stance dancing in general. Stance dancing, for those of you who probably didn't know, was a term used for swapping between long-duration buffs or stances that are meant to be set before the battle and then not changed again. For example, it used to be warriors could only interrupt while in Berserker stance, but warriors like to PvP in battle stance, so in order to interrupt, they would swap their stance to Berserker stance to interrupt, and then swap back to battle stance for everything else. It was complicated gameplay that rewarded good players much more than the average player, and Blizzard didn't really like it, so they removed it all eventually. In Warlords of Draenor, it was changed again to be a passive ability that only Frost Mages had, so you no longer even had the option to armor swap. And its haste was changed to give 8% multi-strike, a short-lived stat that only existed in WoD, which gave your abilities a chance to hit twice, with the second multi-hit only hitting for 30% normal damage, in addition to the normal movement speed slow on hit. In Legion, with the removal of multi-strike, it again just provided a haste buff, as well as just being a passive ability that slowed attackers, until it was finally removed from the game with patch 7.1.5, along with all other mage armors. And the movement slow on attack was instead just moved to Ice Barrier. Mages are once again unprotected. Now it's time to talk about Ice Armor. Ice Armor was the upgraded form of Frost Armor all the way up until Cataclysm. Back in the day, upgraded versions of spells being a completely different spell altogether was very common. You see, spells increased in power with spell ranks that you learned from trainers as you leveled up. And sometimes, instead of learning a new rank, you got a new spell. And then all the future ranks will be added to that new spell only. So once you hit max level, it's not worth ever casting the lesser version of a spell, since it's still at the same level of power as back when you upgraded it, which basically just made it a dead spell in your spellbook. There's a reason they got rid of the system. It just unnecessarily created trap spells for new players, and just cluttered an already cluttered spellbook. In its first form, it was learned at level 30 and gave the exact same things as Frost Armor, more armor and a movement speed slow and haste slow to attackers, but in addition to frost resistance. Spell resistance were a much bigger deal in the earlier days of WoW, but frost resistance was never in very much high demand, so it wasn't as useful. Not to say it was useless. Yes, frost resistance was useful on the frost resistance boss in Naxxramas, and also Sindragosa and Wrath, and probably a few others I'm forgetting. I only say this because I always get comments about how I missed things when I make vague statements like that. Since the only thing Ice Armor gave over Frost Armor was frost resist and more armor, and since it was dispellable until TBC, I guess the use for Frost Armor could have been a cheap mana cost version to recast if all you cared about was the slow effect, since that part was identical. because using rank 1 versions of spells for only the effect and not the damage or armor was very common back in the days. Like shamans using rank 1 Earth Shock to interrupt, or frost mages using rank 1 Frostbolt to slow since it had a quicker cast time and a lower mana cost. As for the changes to the armor, pretty much all the changes for frost armor apply to ice armor. It was made undispellable at the tail end of TBC, and had 2 glyphs in Wrath to increase its armor and frost resistance by 50%, as well as a minor glyph that increased its duration by 30 minutes. Then in Cataclysm, when they removed ranks in lesser versions of spells, they merged ice armor into frost armor's effect, which basically just gave frost armor frost resistance, which they then removed from frost armor 1 patch later. Now, this video was originally going to be one video with all of the mage armors in one, but then I saw just how much stuff there was to talk about, so I decided to split it into multiple parts, which I should be able to later on edit down into one bigger video. Now, the reason this video was done over all the other possible spells and abilities I could cover is because there has been one guy in my comment section asking for these videos non-stop for like 2 years now. So for that dedicated guy who kept asking for a video on mage and warlock armors, I'm finally doing it, and you can finally stop asking for it now.